If you deal with photo or video, then you've probably encountered external hard drives like Samsung T7s, SanDisk Extreme Pros, or even just regular old hard disk drives. But what if I told you you could get even faster drives than a Samsung T9 for less than half the price? Well, today I'm going to explain the differences between the most common types of drives, how you can build your own cheap and super fast custom SSD, and mistakes to look out for when buying the components, so you don't buy the wrong gear and waste your money like I have in the past. So just quickly, for a bit of context, let me explain the most common types of drives. So first of all, we've got hard disk drives, and these are the ones that you might be most familiar with. They're often pretty cheap for the amount of storage you can get, and you can typically expect to get speeds of about 70 to 80 megabytes per second in terms of data transfer speeds. Now, these are probably the slowest of the different types of drives that are currently available, and the reason they're so slow is because they're essentially using physical spinning disks inside the drive to read and write data. It's kind of like old school CDs or DVDs. Now, the next type of drive I want to talk about is SSD drives, and there's basically at the moment two types of SSD drives. The first type is SATA SSDs. Now, SSD stands for solid state drive, and SATA stands for Serial Advancement Technology Attachment. Now, don't worry about the title. I literally had to look it up for this video, but SATA SSDs are kind of like the successor to the old hard disk drives. My SSD gets me read and write speeds of about 300 to 350 megabytes per second, which is obviously significantly faster than the 70 to 80 that you get from a hard disk drive. And essentially the reason why they're faster is because there's no moving internal parts. That's why they've got the name solid state drive, because they're solid, which means they can transfer data with much more efficiency and speed. Now, the last type of drive is basically the successor to the SATA SSD, and that is NVMe SSDs. Now, just so you know, NVMe stands for Non-Volatile Memory Express. And again, that really doesn't matter, but what does matter is the speeds. And on NVMe drives, you can get speeds that range from 1000 to 7,500 or even higher megabytes per second. And this is the type of drive that I'm referring to when I'm saying you can build your own custom NVMe drive for a much cheaper price than a pre-built SSD. For example, here in Australia, you can get a Samsung T9 4TB SSD for about 600 to 750 Australian dollars, which will get you speeds of about 2000 megabytes per second. Now, that is fast and that is a lot of storage, but I recently purchased a 4TB NVMe drive for about 350 Australian dollars. And even when you factor in the price of an enclosure for an NVMe drive, it's significantly cheaper. So the important part, let's talk about how to actually build your own custom SSD. So the first thing you want to think about is an enclosure. Typically, NVMe drives are installed inside computers, directly attached to the motherboard. But if you're like me and you have a Mac that you can't open, or you just want external storage for things like photo and video, then you can get external enclosures that allow you to house the NVMe drive outside of your computer and just use it like a regular external drive. There's basically two types of enclosures. There's 10 gigabit per second drives and 40 gigabit per second drives. And this is essentially just a difference in speed. So if you want to match something like a Samsung T7, which is rated for speeds of about 1000 megabytes per second, then you want to go for a 10 gigabit per second enclosure. And these are typically a lot cheaper than 40 gigabit enclosures, but you are going to be capped at about 950 realistically megabytes per second. Now, if you want to go even faster and get those really high speeds that are beyond most pre-built SSDs, then you want to opt for a 40 gigabit per second enclosure. Now, both these examples I'm showing you here are from Grau Gear. I'm a big fan of both of these enclosures. I definitely recommend Grau Gear if you're looking for one. Check it out using the link in the description. But a 40 gigabit per second enclosure will get you speeds of almost double that of a Samsung T9. Now, once you've picked your speed and your enclosure type, you need to pick an NVMe drive. Now, this is where it can get a little bit tricky, so stick around to the next section where I explain gigabits and megabytes, because there is a difference and it's very important to know. But just for now, if you're going to get a 10 gigabit per second enclosure, then look for an NVMe drive that's rated for about 1500 to 2000 megabytes per second. Or if you've opted for a 40 gigabit per second enclosure, then look for an NVMe drive around 5000 megabytes per second. Then once you've got your two components, it's literally just a matter of putting them together. And typically that's super easy with this 40 gigabit Grau Gear enclosure. All you have to do is unscrew the top, slot in the NVMe drive, apply the included thermal pad. This just helps to dissipate heat because these drives do get quite hot hot, and then reattach the top of the enclosure. And that's it. You can plug it straight into your Mac or PC. So next, let's talk about some mistakes to avoid and things to know when you're shopping for your NVMe drive. There's essentially two things to keep in mind. The first thing is the difference between gigabits per second and megabytes per second. This is crucial. Enclosures are generally rated with gigabits and NVMe drives are typically rated with megabytes per second. If you're still with me, 1 gigabit per second equals 125 megabytes per second. A 10 gigabit enclosure will get theoretical maximum speeds of about 1250 megabytes per second. Realistically, you probably only get about 900 to 950, which also means a 40 gigabit enclosure will probably get maximum speeds of about 3,500 megabytes per second. So just make sure you pay attention when you're buying your enclosure and your drive so that they match up and you get the expected speeds. And the second big thing to watch out for is just to make sure that your USB ports in your computer are actually rated high enough to be able to handle the speeds from your chosen enclosure. So if you've got an older computer, you might have an older type of USB, which means even if you were to get a 40 gigabit enclosure, your USB port might not actually be able to handle it. Now this also applies to USB hubs. I've got a Uni Accessories USB hub that's attached to my desk, and this is only rated for 10 gigabit transfer speeds. However, I recently got this Ivanki USB hub, which is an absolute beast, and this is rated for 40 gigabit per second data transfers, so I can achieve maximum speeds from my enclosure. So lastly, let me share a bit about my experience. Have I noticed a big difference when it comes to using these different types of drives? Now for me, as someone who edits a lot of video, trying to edit off a regular old hard disk drive is painful. It's super laggy and really can't handle 4K and above. Once I jumped to a SATA SSD, which I used for a long time, there was almost no lag and I was able to edit 4K footage off it with no problems. And then jumping from SATA to NVMe, there was a little bit of a difference, but not massive. However, the big difference I noticed going from a SATA to an NVMe drive is data transfer speeds. Now, I'm often having to move large, like 20 to 30 gigabyte projects and video files around, and going from a 10 gigabit to a 40 gigabit NVMe drive, the difference was huge. It was super noticeable, which obviously for me translates into a lot of time saved. So I definitely think, especially if you transfer and move around large amounts of data, particularly with video on a regular basis, then you really can't go wrong with either a 10 gigabit or a 40 gigabit NVMe enclosure. And like I said, they're so much cheaper than getting a pre-built SSD. I think they're totally worth it. Now, if you're looking for more ways to edit really fast, then check out this video here where I share a whole bunch of video editing hacks to speed up your editing workflow.